Okay, with that in mind, we can continue with the test-driven development cycle, or Red-Green-Refactor. You're going to come to love this phrase, or else possibly hate it. So test-first development is, when you think about it, it makes sense. And you know, once you kind of go through it, you're like, wow, why wouldn't you write code this way? Radical concept. Before you sit down and start coding, think about one thing the code should do that you are about to write. Capture that thought in a test, and make sure that that test fails. Why does it fail? Because you haven't actually written any code yet. It has to fail. Then go back and backfill the simplest code you can that lets that test pass. Don't put in generality. You know, anything that's not needed for that test can wait. Right? Your goal is to get that test to pass. And as you go back and do this repeatedly for the different behaviors, you look for opportunities to dry out things that are either common behaviors across parts of the code that you've been writing, or common behaviors across parts of the tests. As we'll see, maybe there's a bunch of tests that all need to have the same starting set of conditions in order to work. There's ways to sort of gather all of those conditions into a single place, just like there was with the background concept in Cucumber. And you keep doing this basically until you get to a point where the method that you're writing or the test, the Cucumber step that you're trying to get to pass becomes green. Right? So this is the Red-Green-Refactor cycle. And the idea is you're always trying to have some working code. Right? Your code is beautiful, it's green, it's working, and oh, you have to add something. So for a short amount of time, there's a part of your code that's red because you're in the process of adding a new feature. Your goal is to, as quickly as possible, get back to all green. Right? So you're sort of improving the quality and functionality of your code in small incremental steps. So how would this work for the controller action? As we said, whenever you're adding a new feature to a Rails app, well, you've got to add a route. Right? There's got to be something that maps the URL submitted by the forum to some place in some controller method that it will go. So we'll do the simplest possible route. The book explains more about the different routing options, but we'll just use this very simple route that we'll post to the search TMDB action in the movies controller. No problem there. What else do we need besides a route? Well, we're going to need a view. Even if we're not going to test what the view does, we'll see that when you trigger a controller method, that's what a controller method's life is, right? It's born, it gets some user input, it does some stuff, and it renders a view. So it's got to have something to render. We will do the simplest possible thing, which is to create a view that has nothing in it, right? And that's fine, because remember, at the end of the day, what we're going to use to verify that the view has all the stuff we need is we're going to use user stories. So we'll just use the Unix touch command, which means create a file with 0 bytes in it, and we'll create a view that's in the right place. And of course, how did we know what the name of this view should be? This is convention over configuration again, right? Because the name of the controller action is search TMDB. It's the movies controller. Therefore, that's where the view goes. OK. And there's, when we were doing the BDD example, if you were following the example in the book actually had a search TMDB method in the controller, and it was hardwired to just always return an empty list, right? It was hardwired so that we could get the SAD path of Cucumber to go all the way through, just so that we could get an idea of how you do the BDD process. Now that we're going to really write this method, we're going to take out that hardwiring nonsense, and we're going to replace it with an empty method, right? A method that does nothing, and this is our starting point. So the last, the pure learning question that we said was, we decided that the model is going to be in charge of having this method that really goes out and talks to TMDB. So you might be thinking, as I was when I started doing this, wait a minute, if I'm writing a test for the controller method, but you're telling me the controller method isn't really doing the work, it's a model method that's going to get called, doesn't that mean that I have to get that model method working first before I can start writing the controller method? And the beautiful, magical answer is no, you don't. So yes, calling TMDB is the model's responsibility. No, we don't have anything that does this yet. No problem. We will use a seam, which is a great concept in testing, and the seam is going to test the code we wish we had. You're going to see this phrase a lot. So I have arbitrarily decided on this name for the non-existent model method. I'm going to call it find in TMDB. Makes sense to me. And here's what our game plan is going to be. For testing the controller, we're first going to simulate the user posting that search form to the controller action, as if they were doing it in real life. And then we're going to check that the controller action tries to call this not yet existent method, find in TMDB, and furthermore, that it passes the data from the submitted form to that method. Notice that I haven't said anything about what this method does, right? Because we're not writing a test for this method. We're writing a test for the controller. The controller's job is to make sure the right method gets called and to pass the right data to that method, and that's it. After that, it's find in TMDB's problem to make sure that the right thing happens. But we're not going to worry about that yet. The test will fail because we just replaced the controller method with this empty method that doesn't do anything. So if we try to write a test that says the controller action will try to call this, well, there's no code, right? Test will fail. But that's good. That's where we want to be. We want a test that is failing for the expected correct reason. And once we've got to that point, then we'll fix the controller action to make the test green. So how do we do this? And yes, if this feels weird, you are not alone. OK, so what's going on here? This is the code we saw before, only now, onto the end of this it block, I've added a do end. Right? So before, we just had an it block with a string saying what the test is supposed to do. Now we're going to write the actual test. This is the key line that kind of characterizes this chunk of lecture. We are setting up an expectation that the movie class, remember, we're writing a class method of movie, right? That's what we agreed on. So the movie class should receive the findInTMDB method call with a particular argument. Right? And how did I choose this? Well, I'm going to pretend that the user has filled in hardware in the search terms box on that page that says search for TMDB. So I set up the expectation. And we'll go through this again, so don't panic. And now I'm going to simulate a post. What is this post verb? This is one of many RSpec extensions that is part of RSpec Rails. Right? So if you're testing a Rails app specifically, as opposed to an arbitrary piece of Ruby code, there's a bunch of SaaS-specific things that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to simulate posting to the controller action. You need to simulate being able to examine what the view would have been like. So RSpec, when you're running it on Rails, gives you a bunch of additional extensions, a few more of which we'll see in the next few minutes that help you do that. So what's going on here? Post, well, we're going to post to the search TMDB method, and that's going to look up a route just like anything else would. And this hash is going to be the contents of the params hash. Right? So remember that when you get inside a controller method, you're handed this thing that quacks like a hash called params, and it's all the stuff the user typed. RSpec gives us a way to essentially fix what that's going to be. Right? So we're going to simulate exactly the same as if a form was submitted to this action in the controller, and these are the params that it got. Right? So there's a couple of different things going on here. Right? There's should receive says, once this post occurs, and once this post action is completed, I'm going to check that, in fact, somebody tried to call a method findInTMDB that's part of the movie class. Failure to have called that method will cause the test to fail. Furthermore, when that method was called, I will also check that the single argument hardware was provided to that method. If that's not the case, then the test will fail. Everybody with me? Let's try it out. So what do I have here? I have that same code you just saw, but I have it in an Emacs buffer. And I have movies controller down here with my empty search TMDB method. And over here on my puny, underpowered MacBook Air, I'm going to start autotest, which is described in the book. Autotest is great for the lazy. You just start it, and then anytime you change any code or add any tests, it automatically reruns everything that could be affected by it. So you just type the command line once and leave it running forever. OK, so what's going to happen here? Failure. Good, right? We like failure. Failure means our test is failing for the right reason. If you're trying to debug something, failure is like finding a treasure, right? When you write a test that actually reproduces your bug, then it's time for a beer. OK, so what's going on here? Let's look at the message. Movie should receive whatever. That's what we expected. It expected to receive it one time, but it received it 0 times. This is exactly what we wanted, right? We know that our test is expressing the correct thing that we want to have happen. So what does it mean to make it pass? Well, OK, let's just call it. OK, what am I doing here? I'm going to call movie findInTMDB, and you say, wait, it doesn't exist yet. That's cool. Don't worry about it. OK? What am I passing? Remember that I'm posting. When I did my post, I said up here, when I did my post, I'm going to pass the value of params. In other words, I'm going to force the value corresponding to if the user had filled in that form. So OK, here's my params. If all is working correctly, then hardware is going to be the thing that params search terms evaluates to. So now if I save this file, notice that autotest just woke up. And we're going to run our test again on my underpowered computer. Thumbs are twiddling. I need a faster Mac. OK, but I'm green, right? Green means go, or cucumber, or something. But what's the difference here? Now, you're saying we don't have this movie findInTMDB method. It doesn't even exist. How could the test be passing if you don't have any damn code? This is the beauty of the code you wish you had. And it's our first example of a concept that I didn't used to have a name for, but now I have one because of this excellent book by Michael Feathers called Working with Legacy Code. A seam is a place where you can change the way your app behaves without editing the code in that place. So what's the seam that we just saw? And by the way, why are seams useful? Well, among other things, when you're testing, you want to isolate the behavior of some piece of code from the behavior of other code it depends on, right? In our case, we wanted to test the controller method. The controller method depends on or collaborates with the model method, but the model method didn't exist yet. So we needed a way to test that the controller method is correctly implemented, even though there are things it depends on that don't exist yet, or even if they did exist, might be buggy. So what's happening here? When we did should receive uses machinery that we've already seen, right, the open classes in Ruby, to create a seam for isolating the controller action. In other words, it overrides find in TMDB. Whoops, model should be movie here. Sorry about this. When I said should receive, there's actually kind of two things you can think of as happening. One of them is find in TMDB doesn't exist. No problem. Should receive will define that method, and the only thing the method will do is check whether it gets called with the right arguments, which is what our test says. In fact, even if we already had implemented movie find in TMDB, it would be overridden by should receive, which is exactly what you want to have happen, right? You don't want it to be the case that, for example, if there's a bug somewhere in should receive, all of a sudden your controller tests start failing, even though the controller code is probably fine. It hasn't changed. So even if this method existed, it would have been overridden. In our case, it didn't exist yet, and that's why the test passes green. So this is an example of a stub, and every time you finish even a single test case, all of the mocks and stubs are automatically reset for you. So that keeps the test independent. So any test that I write after the one that we just did, I would have to reset up this should receive stub if I wanted to do the condition again. Right? It gets reset every time. So we actually did it. We made the spec green by calling find in TMDB. And what we say is that the spec drove the creation of the controller method. Right? We wrote the spec first. We thought about how we'd want the method to behave. Like, what do we want it to do from the point of view of a caller, of a collaborator? We created a test that failed until we satisfied that condition. Now, you might be asking, shouldn't find in TMDB eventually return something? Because it's supposed to call TMDB and get some movies back. So all we've done is write this test that said, did you call the thing? And yeah, we called it, but shouldn't we be checking its return value? We will get to that. But this is another important lesson about testing. Each spec, right, each it clause should test only one behavior. Now, we had a behavior, if you remember, we're going to go back to that previous slide in a moment, where we said one of the things the controller method should do is pass the result of find in TMDB back to the view so that it can be rendered. So yes, that is a requirement, but that's a different requirement from making sure that find in TMDB is called in the first place. Two different requirements, two different test cases. So let's start a slide of testing techniques that we know about. So far, it is a short slide. This is the only thing on it. But we've learned that given an arbitrary object, we can assert that prior to running a test, we'll set up the expectation that it should receive some method call, and optionally, we can say with a certain argument. We could have left off the with. In that case, the only check is whether it gets called or not, and the arguments aren't checked at all. Right? So either of those would have been OK. So this feels weird. Let's take a deep breath. Yes, be all zen. And now let us think.